A 7-year-old boy sitting alone in a roadside diner, drinking water because there was nothing else, quietly drawing a picture of his mother wearing a superhero cape. That was all it took. He didn't march into a boardroom. He didn't file a complaint or hire a lawyer or make a single threat. He just told the truth to a stranger at the next table, the way children do, because it hadn't occurred to him not to. The stranger happened to be Ethan Cole, and Gary Donnelly, who had spent over a decade building a system designed to be untouchable, had no idea that the most dangerous thing in his diner that day wasn't a lawyer, wasn't an investigator, and wasn't a billionaire. It was a boy with a blue crayon and nothing to hide. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The kind of diner that Ethan Cole preferred was the kind most people drove past without a second thought. No valet parking, no hostess at the door, no one checking his name against a reservation list. Just a hand-painted sign in the window, a bell above the door that jangled when you walked in, and the smell of coffee that had been sitting on the burner for too long. Ethan had eaten at enough five-star restaurants in his life to know that the best meals rarely came from them. Comfort had a different address. He pulled his car, a rental, deliberately unremarkable, a gray mid-size sedan that nobody gave a second look in any parking lot in America, into the gravel lot beside the roadside diner just off the highway outside of Columbus, Ohio. His schedule had 2 hours in it before his next meeting across town, and he had no interest in spending those hours being fussed over at some downtown restaurant where someone would eventually recognize his face and want something from him. His assistant had recommended a place called the Meridian, which had a 3-week wait list and served portions the size of a deck of cards on plates the size of a hubcap. Ethan had smiled politely and ignored the recommendation entirely. Out here, he was nobody. That was the point, and the relief of it never wore off no matter how many years passed. The diner was called Donnelly's. The name was stenciled in faded gold letters across the front window, one of the D's slightly crooked, like it had been applied on a windy day and nobody had bothered to fix it. Inside, the place was loud in the way that working-class diners always were. Not the curated noise of a trendy brunch spot, but real noise. The clatter of plates. The hiss of the flat-top grill behind the pass-through window. The scrape of chairs on linoleum that had been mopped so many times the pattern in the center was nearly gone. Truckers with their caps still on, leaning over their coffee cups and talking about road conditions and fuel prices and the stretch of I-70 that was torn up again. A couple of older men sharing a slice of pie at the counter with the easy comfort of people who had been doing exactly that every Tuesday for longer than they could remember. A group of women near the window who looked like they just finished a long shift somewhere. A hospital, maybe, or a school, still in their work clothes, splitting a check and dividing the last of the onion rings with the fairness of people who had learned not to waste anything. Ethan found a table near the back, slid into the booth, and set his phone face down on the table. He picked up the laminated menu without really reading it and looked around the room the way he always did when he entered a new place, quietly cataloging the details that told you what kind of operation you were actually inside. The tables were clean, but sticky at the edges. The napkin dispenser was jammed. One of the overhead lights flickered on and off with the slow persistence of something that had been irritating everyone for weeks and hadn't been replaced. The coffee station behind the counter had a crack in the plastic housing that had been patched with electrical tape. None of this bothered Ethan. He had grown up in places like this. What he didn't notice, after a moment, was the boy at the table next to him. He was small, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sitting perfectly still in the plastic booth seat with the seriousness of someone who had learned that being quiet was a survival skill. He had a cup of water in front of him and nothing else. No food. No phone or tablet. Just a handful of paper napkins he'd pulled from the dispenser and a blue crayon stub he was using to draw with. The drawings were spread across the table, shapes and figures that overlapped each other, some recognizable, some abstract. He was working on one that appeared to be a woman. He drew the woman's arms long and wide, like she was reaching for something. Then he paused, pressed his lips together with the kind of focus that belongs entirely to childhood, and added a cape to her back. The boy had been there since before Ethan sat down. That much was clear. Ethan ordered black coffee when a waitress came by and watched the room settle into its rhythm. The lunch rush was grinding through its peak. More orders coming out of the kitchen window than the floor staff could comfortably handle. Two waitresses were visible, both moving at the kind of pace that wasn't really sustainable, but had somehow become the baseline expectation of the job. One of them was older, heavy-set, moving with the economy of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and knew exactly which corners to cut. The other was younger, early 30s, slender, with her hair pulled back tight, and a look on her face that was simultaneously focused and exhausted. That was the boy's mother. It was obvious from the way she glanced at his table every time she passed. Her name, tag, read Tasha. She was carrying 2 plates in her left hand and balancing a drink tray with her right, weaving between chairs with the precision of someone who had mastered the physics of the room. She moved fast, apologized faster. A man at table 4 complained about his eggs being cold. She said she was sorry and would have them redone before he could finish the sentence. A woman near the window needed a refill. Tasha had the coffee carafe in her hand before the woman had fully raised her cup. And from behind the counter, watching all of it, stood a man who was clearly not helping. He was mid-50s, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had settled permanently into an expression of mild contempt. He wore a short-sleeved button-down shirt and kept his arms crossed the way people do when they want you to know they're watching. That was Gary Donnelly. Every time Tasha passed within earshot, he said something to her. Not loudly enough for the whole room to hear, but you could read the shape of it on his face. Faster. Don't stop. Table 7 is waiting. Ethan sipped his coffee and said nothing. A few minutes later, the boy at the next table reached for his water cup too quickly, and his elbow caught the crayon he'd set on the edge of the table. It rolled off and hit the floor with a small plastic click. The boy scrambled to get it, and in doing so knocked the cup sideways, sending a wave of water across the table and onto the floor. It wasn't a disaster. It was the ordinary clumsiness of being 7 years old. But a man at a nearby table, big guy, red-faced, the kind of loud that takes up more space than the body it came from, turned and let out a short, sharp laugh. He nudged his companion. "Kids shouldn't be sitting around in here," he said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "This isn't a daycare." The boy froze with the crayon in his hand, his face closing up the way children's faces do when they're trying very hard not to cry. Ethan put his coffee cup down. "He knocked over a cup of water," Ethan said, turning toward the man with a calm that was much quieter than an argument. "He's sitting at his own table. Leave him alone." The man looked at Ethan for a moment, sizing him up. Ethan didn't look away. The man said something under his breath, turned back to his plate, and didn't say anything else. The boy was looking at Ethan now. He had dark eyes and a careful expression, like he was trying to figure out what had just happened and whether it was real. Ethan leaned slightly toward the boy's table. "What are you drawing?" The boy hesitated. Then, slowly, he turned one of the napkins around so Ethan could see it. The woman with the cape. Up close, the drawing had more detail than Ethan had noticed from a distance. There was a tiny figure beside the woman, small and round-headed, holding her hand. The woman's cape had what looked like a star on it. "Is that your mom?" Ethan asked. The boy nodded. "She's a superhero," he said. His voice was quiet but certain, the way children say things they have decided completely. Ethan smiled. It was a real smile, which was not something that happened often on his face these days. "She looks like one," he said. The boy seemed to relax slightly. He pulled the napkin back and studied it himself for a moment. Then, with the directness that only very young children have, the kind that bypasses all the filters adults build over a lifetime, he said, "She works really hard, but the boss won't pay her yet." The words landed quietly, but they landed. Ethan set his coffee cup down. "What do you mean?" he asked, keeping his tone even, as though they were just two people continuing a casual conversation. The boy shrugged, but there was weight behind the shrug. She asked him. He said next week. But then next week came, and he said next week again. The boy looked toward the counter where Gary was still standing. "It keeps being next week." Ethan followed the boy's gaze to Gary. "How long has it been next week?" Ethan asked. The boy thought about it, counting in some internal way. "A long time," he said finally. Ethan watched Tasha come out of the kitchen with 2 new plates and swings smoothly past the table of the man who'd complained about his eggs, replacing them with a practiced apology that had no anger in it. She was running on something beyond tired, the kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep. He looked back at Gary. Gary was not watching the floor the way a manager watches for things that need attention. He was watching Tasha the way a person watches something they own. Tasha passed by the counter, and Gary stepped partially into her path. Not enough to stop her, just enough to make her flinch slightly, just enough to say something that didn't register on the room, but registered on her face. She nodded once, quickly, and kept moving. The plates didn't wobble. She had too much practice for that. Ethan had seen 1,000 business operations in his life. He had sat in boardrooms and warehouses and stockrooms and loading docks. He knew what a functioning operation looked like, and he knew what fear looked like when it was being managed rather than fixed. This was the second one. A few minutes later, he saw something that shifted his attention from the floor to the register. A trucker at the counter paid in cash, 2 20s folded together, and Gary took them with the casual ease of a man who had done this 10,000 times, said something, and opened the register. But the money didn't go into the register. Gary's hand came out of his pocket, and then both hands went into the space behind the counter, and then the register closed with a metallic click, and the cash was gone. No ticket entered. No record made. No receipt printed. Just a transaction that existed for one moment, and then didn't, absorb into Gary's afternoon like it had never happened at all. Ethan watched him do it clearly, unhurried, without any particular attempt at concealment. The way people behave when they've done something so many times that they've forgotten it needs to be hidden. Then he watched him do it again 15 minutes later with a different customer, a man in a work jacket who paid for a burger and a coffee and walked out without a second glance. He sat very still and thought about what he'd just seen. When the older waitress came by to refill his coffee, Ethan glanced at her name tag. Rosa. Good coffee, he said. Rosa looked at him the way experienced waitresses look at customers who are trying to start a conversation, measuring it. It's the same coffee as everywhere, she said, but not unkindly. He left it at that for now. Ethan ordered lunch and didn't leave. He opened his laptop and positioned himself as just another man catching up on work at a corner table. Nobody looked twice at him. He ordered his second coffee, and then a slice of pie he didn't eat, and he watched. The lunch rush thinned. The truckers filed out. The older regulars paid up and shuffled toward the door. The noise dropped to a manageable level, and in the relative quiet that followed, the diner's mechanics became clearer. Rosa moved with less urgency now, consolidating her sections, wiping down tables in the unhurried way of someone waiting out the slow hours. Tasha kept moving at almost the same pace she'd held during the rush, because her section never fully emptied and Gary's eyes never fully left her. Malik. The boy had told him his name by now, in that simple way children offer up information when they feel comfortable, had reorganized his napkin drawings into a careful pile, and was working on something new. He used a blue crayon on one napkin and then held it up to look at it, decided something was missing, and kept going. What did you do in school today? Ethan asked him, after a comfortable silence had established itself between them. Malik considered the question with appropriate seriousness. We learned about rivers, he said, how they start small and then get big. Do you like learning about that stuff? I like the part about waterfalls, Malik said, because it doesn't make sense that water can fall that far and not break. Ethan thought about that for a moment. Water's pretty good at absorbing impact. Malik looked at him with an expression that said he was filing that information away. Tasha came by the table with a carafe to refill Ethan's coffee. She glanced at Malik's drawing spread and then at Ethan, and something that looked like cautious gratitude moved across her face. She hadn't heard much of their earlier conversation. She'd been too far away, too busy. But she had seen Ethan step in with the loud man, and she had been aware of the quiet company Ethan had been keeping with her son ever since. He's not bothering you, is he? She asked. She kept her voice light, but Ethan could hear the thread of worry under it. Not all, Ethan said. He's good company. Tasha looked at Malik the way mothers look at children they are proud of and exhausted by simultaneously. Then she topped off the coffee and turned to go. He told me you're a superhero, Ethan said. Tasha paused. He has a lot of imagination, she said quietly. Her voice was careful now. He showed me the drawing. She looked at Malik again. Malik was pretending to be very focused on his crayon work, which meant he was listening to every word. Tasha let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh and tucked the carafe under her arm. Then Ethan said, gently, he also mentioned the paycheck situation. Something moved through Tasha's face quickly, embarrassment, and behind it, fear. She glanced toward the counter. Gary was busy with something on his phone, not looking their way. He's just a kid, she said, keeping her voice low. He doesn't understand all of it. He understands more than you might think, Ethan said. And then, leaving space for her to decide, is everything okay? The question was simple, but it was the kind of simple that is actually complicated, and they both knew it. Tasha's jaw tightened slightly. She straightened up and shifted the carafe in her grip. Everything's fine, she said. Thank you for being kind to him. And she walked away. Ethan watched her go and thought about what was behind that answer. Rosa came by a few minutes later with a plate of fries. She sat at the edge of his table without being asked. Complimentary, she said, for the wait. There hadn't been any unusual wait, but Ethan understood that wasn't really what the fries were about. You've been here a while, Rosa said, not accusatory, just noting it. I'm not in a hurry, Ethan said. Good atmosphere for working. Rosa glanced toward Gary's direction with the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent years keeping their face professional. Then she looked back at Ethan. You seem like a man who notices things. I try to, Ethan said. She nodded once, something decided behind her eyes, and moved to the next table. Malik finished his new drawing and slid it across to Ethan without ceremony. It was the diner. He had drawn the building straight on, with the crooked D in the window faithfully reproduced. And inside, visible through the drawn window, was his mother. She was smiling. In a drawing, at least, she looked like someone who wasn't tired. That's really good, Ethan said, and meant it. She doesn't smile like that much at work, Malik said. He said it factually, without drama, just as an observation about the world. She smiles at home, and when I do good at school. He thought about it. And sometimes when a customer is nice. What about when she gets her paycheck? Ethan asked. Malik shook his head. She doesn't get those, he said simply. Ethan kept his expression even. At all. She has some, but not the new ones. Gary keeps saying the system is messed up. He said it the way a 7-year-old repeats what he has heard adults say. The words adult, the understanding partial, but the retention perfect. She called someone about it, but I don't know who. Ethan nodded slowly. He looked at the drawing of the diner again. Malik, he said, does her mom know you tell me all this stuff? Malik thought about it. She would say I'm not supposed to talk about our private things to strangers. He looked at Ethan directly. But you're not really a stranger anymore. Ethan was quiet for a moment. No, he agreed. I guess I'm not. The afternoon settled into itself. Ethan worked, or appeared to, while continuing to observe. He watched the time-tracking system, or the lack of one. When employees finished their shifts, he saw no digital clock out. No punch card. One of the kitchen workers wrote something on a folded scrap of napkin and tucked it into his apron pocket. Ethan recognized what that was, the informal record-keeping of someone who had learned not to trust the official one. He watched Gary move between the counter and the back office with the easy ownership of someone who believed he had built something that belonged to him completely. Every transaction that came through Gary's hands had the same quality. There was the version that happened, and then there was the version that got recorded, and they were not the same. Around 3 o'clock, Tasha came over to Malik's table and began gathering the napkin drawings, rolling them gently into a loose scroll and tucking them into her apron pocket. She spoke to him quietly, something about homework, and Malik pulled a workbook out of a backpack Ethan hadn't noticed, wedged behind the far leg of the booth seat. He comes every day after school? Ethan asked. Tasha was stacking the cups on the table into a carry pile. She hesitated for half a second. Since January, she said. Childcare got. She stopped, reconsidered, and chose a different route. It works better this way. Ethan knew what the half-finished sentence meant. Childcare wasn't a got. It became impossible. Does the walk take long? He asked. From school to here. This time the pause was a little longer. About 20 minutes, she said. He's good at it. He knows the route. A 7-year-old, walking 20 minutes alone because there was no other option. Ethan said nothing. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold again, and held it. The car's been out a couple weeks, Tasha said, and he could hear that she hadn't intended to say it. It had just come out the way things do when you've been carrying them too long and someone is looking at you with straightforward human attention instead of judgment. The part's ordered, just waiting on it to come in. She said it briskly, like it was a minor logistical item on a short and manageable list. Like none of it weighed anything. She had the tone down perfectly, the tone of a person who has rehearsed being okay so many times it has become automatic. Your boss knows? Ethan asked. Gary doesn't, she started, and then Gary's voice cut across the diner from the counter direction, saying her table 6 needed checking. She was already moving before he finished the sentence. Ethan watched her go. He thought about the boy walking 20 minutes in January, in Ohio, because there was no money for childcare and no car to drive. He thought about the paycheck that kept being next week. He thought about the cash going into Gary's pocket while the people who earned it went without. Then he picked up his phone and typed a message to Daniel Brooks. I need you to pull the business records on a diner called Donnelly's. Columbus area, off Highway 40. Ownership history, LLC structure, labor complaints if there are any. Also any tax filings you can get your hands on. Don't file anything yet. Just look. He set the phone down. Malik was working through his math homework with the focused dissatisfaction of someone who knew the answer was in there somewhere, but wasn't cooperating. He erased something twice, pressed so hard the third time that the pencil left a groove in the paper, and sighed in a way that was very adult. What's the problem? Ethan asked. Malik turned the workbook around. There was a word problem about a train leaving a station. Ethan looked at it. What information do you have? The train goes 60 miles an hour, and it's traveling 240 miles. Okay, so what do you need to find? How long it takes? Right. So if it goes 60 miles every hour, and it needs to go 240 miles. For hours, Malik said suddenly. There you go. Malik wrote it in. He looked at it. That's too easy, he said suspiciously. Sometimes the answer is easier than the problem makes it sound. Ethan said. Rosa passed behind him at that moment, collecting the cold coffee cups from the side stand. She was close enough that Ethan could hear her, and he turned slightly so that his voice didn't carry past her. Rosa, he said quietly, how long have you worked here? She glanced toward the counter, then back to him. The calculation was visible on her face, the weighing of what it cost to speak against what it cost to stay silent. 20 years of that same calculation, probably. 22 years, she said, and her voice was neutral. You know the operation well, then? I know what I've seen. And what's that? Another quick look toward Gary. He was on the phone now, turned 3/4 away from the floor. I've seen a lot of people work very hard in this building, Rosa said quietly, and not get what they were owed. She let that settle for exactly 1 second, then added, that's all I'm going to say about it today. She moved away before Ethan could respond. He sat back in a booth and looked at the room. Tasha was resetting table 6. Malik was finishing his math page. Gary was off the phone now and watching the room again with those crossed arms and that flat expression. Ethan thought about what Malik had said. The boss keeps saying next week. But next week comes, and he says next week again. He thought about what Rosa hadn't quite said. He thought about the cash disappearing without a trace into Gary's pocket twice in one afternoon. And he thought about his mother, whom he hadn't thought about in the context of a place like this in a very long time. She worked 3 jobs. 2 of them had cheated her. She'd never complained in front of him when he was small. She'd done what Tasha did, which was keep moving, keep the plates from dropping, keep saying it was fine. She'd said he didn't need to know about the adult problems. He had found out anyway. Children always do. He looked over at Malik, who had moved on to the next math problem and was mouthing the numbers quietly to himself. Daniel would call back tomorrow. He would have the first layer of it by then. Ethan sat quietly in the corner booth of a diner that smelled like old coffee and somebody's overworked life, and made a decision about what came next. He would come back in the morning. He would keep sitting in this corner. He would keep watching Gary Donnelly pocket money that belonged to people like Tasha, people who showed up and did their jobs and trusted that the person above them was holding up their end of the basic, fundamental agreement that said work gets paid. He looked at Malik one more time. The boy was nearly done with his math page, erasing a small mistake near the bottom with the careful precision of someone who wanted the paper to look right. He had no idea what any of this meant. He had no idea that the thing he'd said quietly to a stranger, "She works really hard, but the boss won't pay her," had set something in motion. He'd just said the truth, the way children do, because it hadn't occurred to him not to. Sometimes that was enough. Ethan left a $20 tip under his coffee cup, said a quiet goodbye to Malik, who waved with his pencil, and walked out into the gray Ohio afternoon. Daniel would call back tomorrow. He would have the first layer of it by then, and then they would see exactly how deep Gary Donnelly's particular version of next week actually went. Daniel Brooks called at 7:45 in the morning. Ethan was already awake, sitting at the small desk in his hotel room with a cup of room service coffee that was better than it had any right to be, reviewing emails he wasn't really reading. When Daniel's name came up on the screen, he picked up on the first ring. "How bad is it?" Ethan asked. Daniel didn't answer that directly, which told Ethan everything he needed to know before a single fact was stated. Daniel was not a dramatic person. He was precise, methodical, and deeply allergic to wasted language. When Daniel paused before answering a direct question, it meant the answer was worse than expected. "Gary Donnelly has been reported for wage theft 4 times in the last 9 years, Daniel said. His voice had the flat, neutral quality of someone reading from a document. 2 of those reports were filed with the Ohio Department of Commerce. One went to the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. One was a civil complaint filed by a former employee in 2019. Results: none. The 2019 case was settled out of court, NDA included. The DOL complaint was closed after the investigator couldn't find sufficient documentation. The 2 state reports were flagged for follow-up, and then appear to have just stopped being followed up." Ethan stood up from the desk and went to the window. The highway was already moving out there, the morning traffic building toward its slow, grinding peak. Why no prosecution? Because every time someone tried to build a case, the paper trail didn't exist, Daniel said. No official timesheets. No payroll records that matched what employees claimed they were owed. Gary's been running a cash-heavy operation for years and keeping 2 sets of books, or more accurately, keeping one legitimate-looking set and one that lives in his head. What's the LLC structure look like? That's where it gets interesting. Ethan could hear Daniel turning pages. The diner itself is registered under a company called DG Restaurant Holdings LLC, which is a Delaware-registered entity. That company is majority-owned by another LLC called Prestige Food Group, which is registered in Wyoming. Prestige Food Group has no public-facing presence, no website, no employees on record, no address that resolves to anything real. Who owns Prestige Food Group? On paper, a man named Gary D. in Columbus, Ohio, but the registered agent is a law firm that specializes in asset protection for small business owners, and the trail gets murky after that. There may be a third entity behind Prestige, but I haven't found it yet. Keep looking. Ethan turned away from the window. What about tax filings? Incomplete and inconsistent. Revenue reported for the diner is significantly lower than what you'd expect for a location that size with that level of traffic. Either he's dramatically undercharging his customers, or he's reporting a fraction of actual cash income. Ethan thought about the 2 cash transactions he'd watched Gary pocket the day before. No ticket, no record, gone. Or both, Ethan said. Or both, Daniel agreed. I want to be clear that none of this is proof of anything yet. What I have is a pattern that looks very bad. To turn it into something actionable, we need documentation from inside the operation, time records, pay stubs, employee statements. I'll work on that, Ethan said. Keep pulling the thread on Prestige Food Group. I want to know if there are other locations connected to this structure. He ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of the hotel room, the hum of the AC unit filling the space where Daniel's voice had been. For complaints. For times someone had tried to do something about Gary Donnelly. For times nothing had come of it. And in the years between each complaint, people like Tasha had kept showing up for their shifts, kept carrying the plates, kept being told the paycheck was coming next week. Each of those 4 complaints represented someone who had finally reached their limit, gathered their courage, picked up the phone. And each of those 4 times, the phone had not been enough. The system that was supposed to protect them had looked at Gary's empty paper trail and come back with its hands equally empty. Ethan thought about that for a moment. The deliberateness of it. The way Gary had built the structure of his operation specifically to survive scrutiny by leaving nothing for scrutiny to find. That wasn't bad luck. That wasn't disorganization. That was design. He got dressed and drove back to the diner. The bell above the door announced him at 8:55. Malik heard it before he saw it. He was already at his usual booth. School didn't start until 9:30, and Tasha had brought him in early before her shift. And when Ethan walked through the door, Malik's face opened up the way children's faces do when something expected and good has happened. "You came back," he said. "I said I would," Ethan replied. Malik had a new drawing ready. He held it up immediately, before Ethan had even fully taken his seat, with the impatience of someone who has been waiting to show something since the moment it was finished. The drawing was of the diner, same as yesterday, but now Ethan was in it. He was easy to identify, tall, sitting in the corner booth with a coffee cup. Malik had drawn him with a small smile. "I put you in," Malik said, in case Ethan had missed it. "I see that," Ethan said. "I look very official." "You look like you're thinking," Malik said. "That's what you do. You think a lot." Ethan looked at the drawing for a moment longer. His mother was in this one too, visible behind the counter, and she was smiling again. The same impossible smile she wore in all of Malik's drawings of her. The one that didn't quite exist in the real version of the room, but was completely real to Malik. Rosa brought coffee without being asked, which meant she'd seen him park. "Morning," she said, setting the cup down. She said it like a question, just barely. "Morning," Ethan said. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked up at her. "Sit down for a minute." Rosa glanced toward the back of the diner. Gary's car was in the lot, but he hadn't come out of the office yet. She sat down across from Ethan with the controlled caution of someone making a calculated decision. "Yesterday you said you've seen people work hard and not get what they were owed," Ethan said. He kept his voice low and steady. "How much are we talking about?" Rosa looked at her hands. "I'm owed close to $4,000, she said, not counting tips that went missing over the last 2 years. She said it quietly, the way you say something you've been holding for so long it has gone from anger to grief. 6 other employees, at least 6 that I know of, are in the same situation. Different amounts. Tasha is owed more than I am. More than $4,000? She's been working doubles. 6 days a week for the last 2 months. Rose's jaw tightened. He told her the extra hours would be reflected in a catch-up payment. She believed him because she needed to. Ethan nodded once. "Who else knows this?" he asked. "Everyone who works here knows," Rosa said. "Knowing and doing something about it are different things. Most of these people are scared. A couple of the kitchen staff are undocumented. One of the other waitresses has a custody situation that makes her afraid to draw any attention to herself. Gary knows all of this. He picks people who can't fight back. He does it on purpose. Of course he does." She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness. Just a flat acknowledgement of a calculated cruelty. He's been doing it for years. The bell above the door rang. A family of 4 came in, shuffling into a booth near the window, the kids already arguing about something. Rosa stood up smoothly and went to greet them, back in her professional register before she'd fully risen from the seat. Ethan drank his coffee. Gary emerged from the back office 40 minutes into the morning, straightening his shirt as he came through the kitchen door. He scanned the room the way he always did, the practiced sweep of a man checking his inventory, and his eyes landed on Ethan for a fraction of a second longer than they landed on anyone else. Then he crossed behind the counter and began his usual circuit. Ethan pretended to read something on his laptop. An hour later, the diner had half filled with the mid-morning crowd. A table near the window had 4 coffees on it that needed refilling. Tasha came out of the kitchen with both hands full and moved toward that table, and Gary intercepted her 2 steps before she reached it. "Table 9's been waiting 12 minutes, he said. "I'm aware. I have 4 plates in my hands," Tasha said. She kept her voice level. "Then you should have gotten table 9's drinks first." He said it loud enough that the couple at table 9 could hear, which was the point. Tasha set the plates down, said a quick apology to the window table, and turned toward table 9. As she passed Gary, he said something under his breath that nobody else in the room caught. Tasha's back went very straight. She didn't respond. Malik, at his booth, was watching this. His crayon had stopped moving. Tasha delivered the drinks to table 9, smiled at the customers, came back for the refill carafe, and kept moving. Efficient. Smooth. Not one crack visible. 10 minutes after that, a plate slipped. It wasn't a full drop, just a tilt and recovery, but the edge of the plate caught the rim of the table and one of the portions slid sideways. A small mess. Nothing broken. Tasha had it cleaned up in under a minute. Gary was across the room in under 30 seconds. That's the second time this week, he said, loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. You know what that cost me? I'm going to have to take it out of. Of what paycheck, Gary? Tasha said. The room got quieter. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply asked the question with a directness that came from somewhere past exhaustion and had landed in something closer to the truth. Gary's expression darkened. Watch your mouth, he said. Malik's hands were flat on the table. He was very still. Ethan watched Gary's face and then looked back at his screen. After Gary walked away, Rosa passed near Tasha and touched her briefly on the arm. Just for a second, the lightest possible gesture of solidarity, and then kept moving. That afternoon, Daniel called again. 2 other diners. One in Dayton, one in Springfield. Same LLC structure. Same pattern of labor complaints with no follow-through. Same shell company ownership. Ethan sat in the corner booth and stared at that information for a long time. This wasn't one man stealing from one diner. This was a system. Ethan woke up the next morning with a clear head and a clear plan. He had spent the previous evening at the hotel desk going through everything Daniel had sent, the financial records, the LLC registrations, the labor complaint histories for all 3 locations. He had made notes in the margin of printed pages the way he used to when he was first building his company, and every decision felt like it was happening on a tightrope. He had not felt that particular quality of focus in a long time, and it surprised him how comfortable it was, like finding an old coat at the back of a closet and discovering it still fit. He drove to the diner and arrived at 9 sharp. The plan for the morning was simple. He would order the most expensive thing on the menu and pay in cash. He would watch what Gary did with it, and he would make sure his phone was positioned to capture whatever happened clearly enough to be useful. The most expensive item at Donnelly's was a steak and egg breakfast for $16.95. Ethan ordered it without looking at the menu. When Rosa brought it out, he ate it slowly. The steak was better than he expected. He left the eggs mostly untouched and drank 2 cups of coffee while he read through emails on his phone with the unhurried quality of a man who had nowhere to be. When the check came, he gave Rosa a 20 and a 10 and told her to keep the change. Rosa said thank you and took the bills to Gary at the register. Ethan had his phone propped against the sugar dispenser, angled toward the counter, the camera running. Gary took the bills. He opened the register. He said something to Rosa that made her nod. And then he counted out $4 and some change and put on Rosa's tray, and he put the rest, the $16 payment, minus Rosa's small change, into his shirt pocket without entering the transaction. Rosa walked back to Ethan's table and set down the change without making eye contact. Thank you, Ethan said, as if nothing had happened. He reviewed the footage under the table, one hand shielding the screen. Clear. Gary's hand, the bills, the pocket. No ambiguity. He texted the clip to Daniel with one line. 3rd time I've seen it. Same result. Document this. Daniel responded in 4 minutes. Received. This is good. Malik arrived at 11:15, which meant it was a half day at school. He came through the door looking for Ethan before he'd even fully cleared the entrance. And when he spotted him in the corner booth, he walked over with the particular determination of someone delivering something important. I finished the drawing from yesterday, he said, pulling a folded napkin from his jacket pocket. It was the diner scene again, but this one had more people in it. Rosa was there, and 2 of the kitchen workers whose names Ethan had learned were Jerome and Pete, and Tasha was front and center with her arms slightly out, like she was holding the whole room together. Malik had drawn her bigger than everyone else. In Malik's understanding of proportion, importance and size were the same thing. That's a full house, Ethan said. These are all the people who work here, Malik said. He pointed to each figure with his finger, naming them. Then he pointed to the small figure in the corner booth. "That's you again." "Still thinking?" Ethan asked. "Now you're writing," Malik said. "Because I see you writing stuff down." Ethan looked at the little corner booth figure on the napkin. Malik had given him a tiny notepad in the drawing. He thought about what to say. "Malik," he said, after a moment, "has your mom talked to anyone official about not getting her paycheck? Like any office or department?" Malik considered this. "She called somewhere," he said. "But then she stopped calling because Gary said if she kept making trouble there wouldn't be anything to pay her. He threatened her." Malik heard the word threatened, and his expression shifted. Not confused, just very serious. "He's mean," he said simply. "He makes her feel like she's supposed to be grateful for something bad." Ethan sat with that for a moment. "He makes it seem like having the job at all is the favor," he said. "Yeah," Malik said. "Like she should say thank you for being treated bad." He picked up a red crayon from the table dispenser and started adding something to one of his other napkins, unbothered in the way of children who have moved through a difficult truth and immediately returned to drawing. "I told her I'd buy her a house when I grow up, so she won't have to work for someone like Gary." Ethan looked at him. "What kind of house?" "A big one," Malik said, "with a yard and a driveway so the car can stay off the street." He paused, thinking. "And a kitchen where she can cook what she wants instead of what somebody else tells her to." Ethan didn't say anything for a while. He thought about being 8 years old, sitting in a kitchen not unlike this one, watching his mother come home from a double shift with her shoes still on because she didn't have the energy to take them off, eating cold cereal for dinner because she was too tired to make anything and too proud to say so. He thought about the way she would set her bag down on the chair by the door, always the same chair, always with the same controlled quiet, and then stand in the kitchen for a moment with her back to him, like she was collecting something before she had to turn around and be okay. He thought about the Saturday she had come home and said very carefully that the restaurant had said there'd been a miscalculation in the overtime and she wouldn't be getting the extra hours this cycle. And his father had started to say something angry, and his mother had just shaken her head with the smallest movement and said not in front of him. He had been in front of them. He had heard every word. He had not said anything for 30 years because his mother had asked him, without asking, not to. "That's a good house," he said finally. Malik nodded like it was already decided. Rosa appeared at his elbow with a coffee carafe. She poured without being asked, as had become the rhythm of things, and as she straightened up, she tilted her head slightly toward the back of the room. Ethan followed the direction of the tilt. Gary was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, looking directly at Ethan with an expression that was different from the general watchfulness of the last 2 days. This was something more specific. Gary had been doing addition in his head, and the numbers were starting to bother him. Ethan looked back at his phone. A few minutes later, Gary came out from behind the counter and walked toward the corner booth with the careful walk of a man who had decided to say something but hadn't quite settled on what. "You're in here a lot," Gary said. He stopped beside the table without sitting down. "Good coffee," Ethan said. "Where are you from?" "Passing through," Ethan said. "I travel for work." "What kind of work?" Ethan looked up at him with a neutral expression. "Consulting," he said, which was close enough to true and revealed nothing. Gary looked at Malik, who had gone very still and was looking at his napkin drawing with the practiced invisibility of a child who knows how to disappear. "Your kid?" Gary asked. "No," Ethan said. "Then maybe you should let the staff do their jobs instead of chatting them up," Gary said. He said it with a smile that wasn't a smile. "And the kids, too. Customers are here to eat, not socialize." Ethan met Gary's eyes and held them. "I've been eating," he said pleasantly. "Is there a problem with my table?" Gary's non-smile held for a moment. "No problem," he said. "Just saying." "Appreciated," Ethan said and went back to his phone. Gary stood there for 2 seconds longer than was comfortable, then turned and walked back toward the counter. Ethan watched him go and then looked at Malik, who looked back at him with wide eyes. "He doesn't like you," Malik whispered. "No," Ethan agreed. "He doesn't like anybody," Malik added. "But he especially doesn't like you." 2 hours later, the afternoon crowd had thinned and the diner had reached its quiet stretch. Jerome from the kitchen had been cut and was collecting his jacket from the hook by the back door. As he passed through the dining room, Ethan caught his eye and gave the smallest possible nod toward the empty seat across from him. Jerome looked at the seat, then toward the counter. Gary was in the back office and sat down. He was in his 40s, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of steadiness about him that came from long years in physical work. He looked at Ethan directly. "You're not just passing through," Jerome said. It was not a question. "No," Ethan said. "I'm not." Jerome was quiet for a moment. "How many people you talk to?" "Rosa, you be the second." "What are you trying to do?" Ethan said, "I want to understand the full picture. What's been owed for how long to who? I'm not from any agency, and I'm not looking to create problems for anyone here except Gary." Jerome looked at the table. He worked the inside of his cheek. "I'm owed 6 weeks," he said finally. 2 of the guys in the kitchen are in the same boat. He told us the payroll company switched systems, and there was a delay. That was 8 weeks ago. He paused. Pete's wife just had a baby. He's afraid if he makes noise he'll lose the job and have nothing. He's been using that, Ethan said. He always uses it, Jerome said. New employees, people with problems, people who need steady work more than they need justice. His voice was even, but the evenness was the product of controlled anger, and Ethan could hear the seams. This is what he does. He picks people who can't afford to walk away. Ethan thought about what Daniel had said about the other 2 locations. Same structure, same method, not improvised cruelty, a template. If there was a way to document everything officially, Ethan said, statements, records, whatever you have, would you be willing? Jerome looked at him for a long moment. Depends on what happens to the people who talk, he said. I've got kids. I can't be doing something that ends with me having no job and a lawsuit. I understand, Ethan said. I'm not asking for anything today. I'm asking you to think about it. Jerome nodded once, stood up, and walked out without another word. Ethan watched him go and then looked at the booth seat across from him, which still held the faint warmth of a man deciding whether trust was something he could afford. That evening, Ethan was sitting at the counter. He had changed position, a small shift in geography that was mostly about staying until the end of Tasha's shift, when Gary came out of the back and went to the register. The last table had paid out. The diner was effectively empty. Gary opened the register and began counting the day's cash with the efficiency of long practice. He sorted it into stacks, set aside an amount that presumably corresponded to the official record, and slid the remainder to one side in a way that was casual and very deliberate. Then Tasha came out of the kitchen with her jacket and her bag, Malik beside her, rubbing his eyes. Gary, Tasha said, stopping a few feet from the counter, I need to talk to you about the paycheck. Not tonight, Gary said, without looking up from the register. It's been 3 weeks since. I said not tonight, Tasha. He kept counting. 3 weeks, she said again. Her voice was steady. I have rent. Gary set the cash down and looked at her for the first time. You want to have this conversation right now? He said. Fina, you dropped a plate this week. You were late back from your break twice. You want to talk about what that costs? I want to talk about my paycheck, Tasha said. Then come in early tomorrow, and we'll go over your hours, Gary said. Because I guarantee my numbers and your numbers are not the same. He said it with absolute confidence. The confidence of a man who controls all the numbers and therefore controls the conversation. Tasha's jaw was tight. Malik had reached up and taken her hand. Gary looked at the boy for a moment, then back at Tasha. You don't like how I run things, he said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous. You're free to go find something better, but I wouldn't count on a reference. He paused, and I wouldn't count on getting paid for the last week if you leave without notice. The room was very quiet. He can't do that, Malik said, his voice small but clear. He was looking at Gary directly. She worked those days. Gary's eyes moved to Malik with a cold patience that was worse than anger. Son, he said, grown-up business. Ethan stood up from the counter stool. Actually, he said quietly, he's right. Gary turned. Ethan was standing with one hand in his pocket and the other holding his phone, loose at his side, with the relaxed composure of someone who has been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. She worked the hours, Ethan said. You owe her for them. That's not a negotiation. That's the law. Gary's expression shifted through several registers. You got something to say? Say it to somebody who asked. You owe every person in this building, Ethan said, still in that same calm voice. I've been watching for 3 days, and I've seen enough to know that. He looked at Gary evenly. So when you say she can leave without getting paid, I need you to think very carefully about whether you want to keep going in that direction. Gary stared at him. Who the hell do you think you are? Gary said. Ethan held the gaze and let the silence sit there for a full 3 seconds. We need to talk about that money, he said. Gary said nothing. The register was still open beside him. The separated cash sat on the counter in 2 distinct stacks, the recorded amount and the other one, and Gary's hand moved instinctively toward both of them, which was the most honest thing he had done all day. Malik looked up at Ethan, not quite sure what he was watching, but understanding that something important was shifting in the room and that the man standing calmly by the counter stool was not going to sit back down. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. Tasha's hand tightened around her son's. She held her breath. The diner held its breath with her. The silence that followed Ethan's words was the kind that fills a room completely. Gary stood behind the counter with both hands flat on the register, the cash still visible in its 2 separate piles, and he looked at Ethan the way men look at someone when they're trying to decide whether to be angry or afraid and haven't finished deciding yet. The couple at the corner table had stopped eating. The 2 remaining waitstaff near the kitchen door had gone perfectly still. Even a hum of the refrigerator unit seemed to step back and give a moment space. Tasha stood with Malik's hand in hers, her jacket half on, not moving. Gary found his voice first. You want to repeat that? He said. I don't think I need to, Ethan said. You heard it fine. Gary straightened up, rolling his shoulders back with the slow deliberateness of a man reclaiming physical authority over a room. I don't know who you think you are, he said, louder now, his voice hitting the edges of the room so everyone could hear exactly who was in charge here. But you've been sitting in my diner for 3 days eating my food and putting your nose in things that have nothing to do with you. So I'm going to ask you very politely to pay your check and leave. I already paid, Ethan said. I tipped well, too, unlike some people in this building. Gary's face went through several changes at once. You think this is funny? I don't, Ethan said. I think it's straightforward. You owe your employees wages you've been withholding. That's wage theft. It's a violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act and Ohio state labor law. The fact that it hasn't been prosecuted before doesn't make it legal. It makes you lucky. And I think your luck is done. Gary let out a short, humorless laugh. Are you a lawyer? No. Then you don't know what you're talking about. I know what I watched you do with cash transactions 3 times in the last 4 days, Ethan said. I know what your employees are owed and for how long. And I know your LLC structure goes through a Wyoming shell company that doesn't have a real address. He said the same way he'd say anything quietly without heat. So if you want to keep talking about what I do or don't know, we've got time. The room had not moved. Gary's jaw was tight. He looked at the staff near the kitchen door, then at the couple in the corner, then back at Ethan. Get out of my diner, he said. In a moment, Ethan said. He turned to Tasha. Are you okay? Tasha looked at him. Her expression was complicated, gratitude and fear and something that hadn't sorted itself out yet. She nodded once, small. Malik was watching Ethan with the focused attention of someone watching something they want to remember. Gary took a step around the counter. I said get out. And I'll go, Ethan said, without moving, after you tell this woman when she's getting her paycheck. A specific date. Not next week. An actual date. Gary stopped. His hands came up in a gesture that was meant to look like exasperation and came out looking like desperation. This is none of your business. You don't know these people. You don't know this situation. She's worked 3 weeks without pay, Ethan said. Double shifts. 6 days a week. I think I know enough. Gary turned to Tasha with the dangerous calm of someone who has run out of the anger that shows and moved into the kind that doesn't. If you're behind this. She's not, Ethan said. This is me. A long pause. Gary looked at Ethan one final time with an expression that carried everything. Contempt, calculation, and underneath both, the first real trace of worry. I'll be back tomorrow, Ethan said pleasantly. He picked up his jacket from the stool. Have a good evening, Gary. He held the door for Tasha and Malik as they walked out ahead of him. The bell above the door rang as it always did. The same small sound it made for every customer who left, but tonight it felt different. Tasha exhaled slowly on the sidewalk, her breath visible in the cold evening air. Malik looked up at Ethan. The parking lot light caught his face, and he looked, for just a moment, older than 7. Not in a sad way, but in the way of children who have seen more of the world than they should have had to and have processed it without complaint. "You didn't yell?" Malik said. "I didn't need to," Ethan said. Malik thought about that with the genuine consideration he gave most things. "Is she going to get her money?" "Yes," Ethan said. "She is." He said it the way you say things when you've already decided they are true, and the only remaining question is the logistics. They stood together in the parking lot for a moment, the highway audible in the distance, the lot lights buzzing quietly overhead. The night had gotten colder while they were inside. Tasha pulled Malik's jacket tighter around his shoulders with both hands, and then straightened up and looked at Ethan with a direct, unguarded expression of someone who had run out of the energy required to be guarded. "Who are you?" she asked. "Not unfriendly, just honest. Someone who's going to make sure this gets fixed," Ethan said. She studied his face for a long moment, reading something in it that she seemed to find acceptable. Then she nodded once. It wasn't complete trust. She hadn't known him long enough for that, and she was a woman who had learned that trust given too easily came back to hurt you. But it was the beginning of it, a door opening just wide enough to let some light through. Back inside, Gary waited until the parking lot lights showed them walking away. Then he went to his back office, shut the door, and sat down heavily in his chair. He sat without moving for almost a full minute. The only sound in the small room was the low vibration of the building's heating system and the muffled noise of Rosa clearing the last few tables in the dining room. He was not stupid. That was the thing about Gary Donnelly that people sometimes underestimated. He was not stupid, and he was not reckless by nature. Every delayed paycheck, every shell company, every off-the-books cash transaction had been carefully designed to be untouchable. He had built the structure over years, not months. Delaware registration for the restaurant entity, Wyoming holding company behind it, a registered agent firm in Nevada that handled paperwork without asking questions. Nothing in his personal name that a labor inspector could reach without a court order, and no paper trail that would survive long enough to support one. He had done this for over a decade. He had survived 4 complaints. He had survived 2 visits from the Department of Labor. Both times the investigators had come in looking for documentation that Gary had made sure didn't exist in any traceable form. He had survived a civil case in 2019 that had ended with a signed NDA and a payment that cost him less than a month's worth of what he'd been holding back. The system had tested his structure, and the structure had held. But this man was different. He knew the Wyoming LLC by name. He knew the layered ownership. He had mentioned the FLSA with the casual familiarity of someone who worked with it professionally, not someone who had looked it up in the last 20 minutes. And he had been watching, sitting in the corner booth for 3 days with his laptop open, watching everything with the patience of someone who was building something rather than reacting. Gary did not know who he was. That was the part that scared him most. He had dealt with angry employees before. He had dealt with family members who showed up to argue on someone's behalf. He had even dealt with a local journalist once, a young woman with a voice recorder and a notepad, and that had been handled with a brief phone call to someone who knew someone at the paper. But this man carried no recorder and no notepad. He asked questions like a lawyer, but said he wasn't one. He knew financials like an accountant, but didn't have the look of one. He paid in cash, he drove a rental, and nobody on the staff seemed to know anything about him beyond the fact that he had been kind to the Carter boy. Gary picked up his phone. "I've got a problem at the Columbus location," he said when it connected. "I need to know who this guy is, and I need to move the account before someone starts asking questions. All 3 locations. Tonight, if possible." There was a pause on the other end. "Then how serious?" "Serious enough that I'm calling you," Gary said. That same evening, Ethan sat across from Daniel at a hotel restaurant table with documents spread between them and 2 untouched glasses of water. "He's rattled," Ethan said. He didn't expect anyone to know the LLC structure. "He shouldn't be rattled yet," Daniel said. "What we have is circumstantial. The video is good, but a defense attorney can test the context. Gary could argue the cash was going into a separate petty cash fund, that the register entry was made later in the shift, half a dozen other things. We need employee statements on the record and documented hours that don't match what he's reported to the state. Jerome will talk, Ethan said. Rose is ready. A couple of the kitchen staff are close. Close isn't testimony, Daniel said. He wasn't being pessimistic. He was being accurate, which was what Ethan paid him for. What's the timeline pressure? Realistically, Ethan leaned forward on the table. Gary made a comment about moving money before inspectors started asking questions. Malik overheard part of a phone conversation. The words were vague, but the intent wasn't. He paused. He's going to start moving assets. He's already thinking about it. We need the Labor Department in there before he has a chance to restructure the accounts. Daniel was quiet for a moment, working through the file with the methodical attention of someone assembling a sequence rather than just reading. Then he looked up. I can contact the Wage and Hour Division field office here in Columbus. I know the regional director personally. We worked a case together in 2021. If we bring him the video footage, the LLC documentation, and my financial analysis showing the inconsistency between reported revenue and foot traffic, he has enough to justify fast-tracking an audit. How fast? If I call tonight, and if I make clear that the subject may be moving assets, 2 days, maybe less, then let's not wait, Ethan said. Daniel closed the folder and slid one additional page across the table. There's one more thing you need to see. He tapped the corner of the page. Springfield location, a third LLC connected to the same holding structure. It's not a restaurant. It's a cleaning company called Prestige Clean Solutions, registered under the same Prestige Food Group umbrella. 6 employees on official record, but the hours logged against cleaning contracts in the area suggest at minimum 12 to 14 workers actually on the floor. Ethan looked at the page without speaking for a moment. Gary Donnelly had built a small, quiet empire on the labor of people who could not afford to fight him. Not just at Donnelly's Diner, not just in Columbus. He had taken the same template, underpay, delay, threaten, repeat, and replicated it across multiple businesses and multiple industries, always choosing workers whose situations made silence the path of least resistance. It was not the messiness of a bad employer. It was the precision of a practice system. The cleaning company employees, Ethan said. Any labor complaints on record? 2, Daniel said. Both were filed by anonymous callers. Neither was investigated past the initial intake stage. Ethan thought about the people filing those complaints, picking up the phone, giving their account to someone at a government hotline, waiting for something to happen, and receiving nothing back. Going back to work the following Monday because there was no other option. Call the director tonight, Ethan said. I want the audit request formally submitted before midnight. All 3 locations, if possible. Daniel was already reaching for his phone. Ethan was back in the diner before 9 the next morning. Malik was already there, sitting in the corner booth with fresh napkins spread across the table and a crayon already moving. He spotted Ethan the moment he came through the door, and his face changed the way it always did, open and immediate, without the cautious measuring that adults add to every greeting. You came back again, Malik said. I said I would. You said that yesterday, too. He pushed a napkin across. I made you a new one. Ethan sat down and looked at it. He was in this drawing again, standing at the counter with the phone in hand. Tasha stood beside him, her cape larger than in any previous version, the star on it filled in with careful red crayon. And Malik had put himself in it this time, a small figure beside Tasha, one hand lifted to the edge of the cape. Ethan looked at it for a long moment. I put us both in it, Malik said. I see that. Ethan propped the napkin against the sugar dispenser. Thank you. Gary arrived at 9:15, took his usual post behind the counter, and began his morning surveillance of the room. But today the watching was different, sharper, more specific. He tracked Ethan with the attention of someone who had spent the night doing research and had not found what he was looking for, which was more unsettling than finding something incriminating would have been. Rosa brought coffee without being asked and said nothing. At 10, a regular customer paid his $6 check in cash. Gary took the bills, opened the register, and the money went into his pocket. Same as always. Ethan had the phone in position before Gary's hand cleared the counter. Clear footage. Good angle. He forwarded the clip to Daniel. An hour later, Daniel walked in wearing a gray jacket, carrying a laptop bag, looking exactly like someone catching up on work. He took a window table, ordered coffee, and opened his laptop. He and Ethan made no visible acknowledgement of each other. Rosa recognized Daniel. She brought his coffee and said nothing, and that was enough. Over the next hour, 3 employees came to Daniel's table in the natural flow of their work. Each stop looked like ordinary service, a refill, an order drop, a table clear. Each lasted 2 to 4 minutes. In those small windows, Daniel collected what he had come for. The first was a young woman named Carla who worked weekday lunch shifts. She had been hired 6 months ago and had received 2 paychecks, both short of what her hours should have reflected. She had asked Gary about the discrepancy twice. The first time he had told her the payroll system ran behind on part-time hours. The second time he had told her she was lucky to have a job at all and that nobody was forcing her to stay. She said all of this in a steady voice, standing beside Daniel's table with a coffee carafe in her hand, looking like she was asking if he needed a refill. She was done in 90 seconds. The second was Pete from the kitchen, who had been reluctant in every previous conversation Ethan had seen. He came out during a lull, wearing his jacket, like he was heading to his car on a break, and sat down across from Daniel for 3 minutes. His wife had delivered their son 4 weeks ago. He was behind on rent. He had worked 63 hours in the past 2 weeks, and his last paycheck had reflected 40. He told Daniel what he was owed. He named the dates. He said he would sign a statement if it meant what he'd earned would actually come to him. Then he stood up, said nothing further, and went back to the kitchen. Jerome sat with Daniel for 4 minutes during a mid-morning lull, jacket on like he was heading out. He gave a precise account of 6 weeks of missing pay for himself and 2 named colleagues, the dates he had approached Gary about it, and Gary's responses on each occasion, including the specific comment about the payroll system switching providers, which Jerome had written down on his phone the same night Gary said it, because something about it had felt like a lie he would need to remember. Daniel typed steadily the entire time, not looking up, his fingers moving with quiet efficiency. Gary was watching the room, but he was watching Ethan, and that narrow focus made him careless about everything else in it. At 11, the diner had settled into its slow, mid-morning pace. Malik finished his drawings and opened his reading worksheet. After a while, he got up to refill his water cup at the station near the kitchen, and on his way back, he passed the end of the counter. Gary was on his phone. His voice was low and tight. He was turned partly away from the room, but not enough. Malik slowed. He heard the word accounts, and before Thursday, and the other 2 locations are handled. He went back to his booth and sat down. He turned the words over in his head the way he did with math problems. Not all of it made sense, but some of it did. Before Thursday meant before a deadline. The other 2 locations meant there were other places like this one. He looked at Ethan. "Ethan," he said quietly. Ethan looked up from his phone. Malik leaned across the aisle, dropping his voice. Gary was on the phone just now. He said something about accounts and before Thursday. And the other 2 locations are handled. Ethan went still. "The other 2 locations," he repeated. Malik nodded. "I don't know." Gary leaned in slightly, dropping his voice to the register people use when they want to say something threatening and also want to be able to deny they said it. "I've had people try to cause trouble before. It never goes anywhere. I'm still standing here." "You are," Ethan said, "for about 1 more day." The words landed quietly, and that was what made them land hard. There was no drama in Ethan's delivery, no satisfaction, no provocation. He said it like a man reading an estimated arrival time from a screen. Something shifted in Gary's expression. Not quite fear yet, but the border of it. The edge of a realization that was still trying not to fully form. He straightened up and looked around the room slowly, taking stock of it. At Daniel near the window, still typing. At Rosa moving through her section with efficient, unhurried calm. At Malik in his booth, pencil moving. At Tasha coming through the kitchen door with plates balanced in both arms. Already offering a small apology to the table she was heading toward for making them wait. He looked like someone doing an inventory and not being able to account for several items. Then he walked back to the counter without another word, picked up his phone, and made another call. Rosa passed Ethan's table a minute after Gary walked away. She refilled his coffee without slowing and said quietly, without looking at him, "He's been on the phone 4 times since this morning. He called the storage company about the safe an hour ago." "I know," Ethan said. "Is it going to be enough?" she asked. "What we've given your friend over there." Between the statements and the video and what Daniel has on the financial structure, Ethan kept his voice low and even. "Yes, it's going to be more than enough." Rosa moved on to the next table without changing her expression. Ethan sat for a moment with his coffee. He thought about the regional director Daniel had spoken to the previous night, the call that had gone for 40 minutes. Daniel laying out the evidence piece by piece with his characteristic precision, while Ethan sat nearby reading through the financial files one more time. The director had said 2 words at the end of it before the call wrapped up. Ethan had heard them from across the room. "We're coming." He looked over at Malik, who had finished his worksheet and was now sitting with his chin in one hand looking out the window at the parking lot, the unfocused gaze of a child letting his mind wander somewhere better than the present moment. He had delivered the key piece of information that morning without knowing the full weight of it. 3 words overheard at the end of a counter and carried back to the right person before Gary could finish the call that would have given him his final window to act. That was what Malik did. He moved through the world with honesty and instinct and the uncomplicated reflex to tell the truth to people he trusted, and somehow that turned out to be enough. More than enough. Ethan picked up the napkin drawing from against the sugar dispenser and folded it carefully into his jacket pocket, alongside the one from yesterday and the one from the day before. He had 4 of them now. He had been folding them and saving them without consciously deciding to, and it was only now that he noticed the small weight of them against his chest. He finished his coffee. Tomorrow the investigators would come through that door. And for the first time in as long as anyone in this diner could remember, next week would finally mean exactly what it was supposed to mean. They came in at 9:17 the next morning. 2 of them, a man and a woman, both in plain clothes. No uniforms, no badges visible from the door, but the way they walked and said everything. They moved with the unhurried authority of people who had done this before and were not rushing because the building was not going anywhere. The man carried a leather satchel, and the woman had a clipboard with a stack of forms already separated and ready. They stopped just inside the door and looked around the room the way investigators look around rooms. Not like customers deciding where to sit, but like people reading a scene. The morning crowd was at half capacity. Truckers at the counter. A family near the window. Tasha was already on the floor, carrying plates from the kitchen pass-through with the focused efficiency of her regular routine. Malik was in his usual booth with his backpack, school not starting for another hour. Rosa saw the investigators first. She was refilling the counter coffee when they came through the door, and she set the carafe down slowly and stood very still for a moment. The way a person stands when something they've been quietly hoping for a long time has just walked through a door and they need a second before they let themselves believe it. It wasn't something else. Gary was in the kitchen. He came through the swinging door 2 minutes after the investigators entered, carrying a printed sheet from the back office printer, and he stopped completely when he saw them standing near the entrance. The woman spoke first. "Are you Gary Donnelly?" Gary's face went through its changes quickly. Surprise, then the practiced neutrality of someone defaulting to a routine they had rehearsed for situations they hoped would never come. "I am," he said. "Can I help you?" "We're with the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division," the man said. He produced a credential wallet from the satchel. "We have an order to review the payroll records, time sheets, and employment documentation for this location. We'd like to start with whatever records you have on file for the past 18 months. The printed sheet in Gary's hand crinkled slightly at the corners. He smoothed it once against his leg. "I need to call my attorney," he said. "That's completely your right," the woman said, making a note. "We'll wait." Gary looked around the room. He looked at Ethan, who was in the corner booth with his coffee and his phone, the same position he had occupied for 5 days, looking back at him with no particular expression. He looked at Rosa, who had returned to her section and was pouring coffee with deliberate calm. He looked at Tasha, who had stopped between tables and was standing with 2 plates in her hands, watching him. Gary's jaw tightened. He turned and walked back toward the office. The investigators stationed themselves at a table near the register and settled in to wait. The dining room continued around them, but quieter than usual. Conversations dropped to murmurs. The kitchen went subdued. Even the bell above the entrance seemed to ring more carefully when the next customer came through. Gary emerged from the office 20 minutes later without having made a successful call. His attorney, apparently, had not picked up. He came to the investigator's table with a folder. Thin, Ethan noticed. Much thinner than 18 months of payroll records for a diner this size should be. The woman opened the folder and began reviewing its contents without urgency. The man typed on his tablet. A minute passed. Then 2. Mr. Donnelly, the woman said, without looking up, these records show only 11 employees on payroll. Can you confirm that's the current total staff at this location? That's correct, Gary said. Including kitchen staff? Yes. The man looked up from his tablet. We have signed statement from 14 individuals identifying themselves as current employees of this location. Gary said nothing. We also have documentation indicating at least 6 of those individuals have not received a paycheck in anywhere from 2 to 7 weeks. The woman continued, in the same measured tone that had no heat in it but no give either. Is there a payroll processing issue we should be aware of? There was a system transition, Gary said. We switched providers. There were delays. A 7-week delay, the man said. There were complications. Rosa, who had drifted near the service station, made a short sound that she turned quickly into a cough. The investigators exchanged a brief look. We're also going to need access to your cash register records and daily transaction logs for the same period, the woman said, and documentation for any additional business entities operating under the same ownership that share employees or financial accounts with this location. Gary's hand on the table edge went white at the knuckles. I'll need to call my attorney, he said again. Of course, she said. You mentioned that. We'll be here. Tasha had set her 2 plates down at the nearest table without the customers fully registering it. She was watching Gary with the careful stillness she always used when he was near, but her hands were loose at her sides, which they usually weren't, and she was standing with her weight distributed evenly instead of the slight forward lean of someone braced to respond to his next instruction. After a long pause, during which Gary stood at the investigator's table looking for a version of this moment that worked in his favor and found none, Tasha walked over. I haven't received a paycheck in 3 weeks, she said to the woman investigator. Her voice was steady and clear. I've been working double shifts, 6 days a week. I asked Mr. Donnelly about it multiple times. The last time I asked, he told me that if I kept bringing it up, I shouldn't count on being paid for my final week regardless. The woman wrote without pausing. Can you give me the specific dates you requested payment and the responses you received? Yes, Tasha said. I can. She sat down and began to speak. Gary watched this for approximately 4 seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the back with the rapid, stiff stride of a man who has lost the room and is retreating to the only space he has left. From the office, his voice reached the dining room in fragments. Urgent, clipped, the words not audible through the walls, but the tone unmistakable. He was on the phone again, trying to compress damage control into whatever window he thought remained. He came back out 8 minutes later. The practiced neutrality was gone. What replaced it was rawer, anger without a plan behind it, which is the most transparent kind. This is a coordinated attack, he said loudly, to the room at large and the investigators specifically. This man, he pointed toward Ethan, came in here 5 days ago and has been talking to my staff, recording people without consent, trying to destroy a legitimate business. The dining room was completely silent. The investigators looked at Ethan. Would you like to respond? The man asked. Ethan set his coffee cup down. He reached into his jacket, produced his phone, and placed it on the table. I have 4 video recordings of Mr. Donnelly accepting cash payments and placing the money in his pocket without entering the transactions into the register, Ethan said. Each includes a timestamp and a clear image of where the cash went. I'll provide copies to your office. He looked at Gary. I didn't plan anything, Ethan said. I just watched. Gary's voice, when it came, was stripped of everything it usually carried. The authority, the impatience, the quiet threat of it. Just the sound of a person watching something they built come apart in a room full of witnesses. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. "You think you can walk into someone's business. You can finish that with your attorney," the woman investigator said, with complete finality. Gary stopped. Daniel, who had come in quietly during the exchange, slid a folder across his window table toward the male investigator. "Supplementary financial documentation," he said. "Inconsistencies between reported revenue and estimated traffic at this location, and LLC registration records for 2 additional businesses under the same ownership." The investigator opened it. Gary looked at Daniel. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Rosa, at Tasha, at Jerome and Pete near the kitchen door, and finally at Malik, who was sitting very still in his booth with his hands flat on the table, watching with the large, serious eyes of a child who understood that something important had just finished. "Mr. Donnelly," the woman said, "the diner will be suspended from operations pending the completion of our audit. You are not to remove or alter any business records or financial materials from this property." Gary stood in the middle of the dining room with nowhere to go and nothing left to say. 2 people with clipboards were writing things down, and nobody in the room was looking at him with the fear he had spent years engineering. He walked out through the front door. The bell rang once. Then the room was quiet. Malik slowly unclenched his hands. His mother came to stand beside the booth and put her arm around his shoulders. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. Tasha looked across the room at Ethan, who nodded once. "Yeah, baby," she said. "It's over." The audit findings came through within days. Unpaid wages totaling just over $62,000 at the Columbus location alone. Gary had been withholding paychecks, skimming tips, and logging false hours for at least 3 years at Donnelly's. The record gaps made it difficult to trace further back, which had always been deliberate. The 2 connected businesses in Dayton and Springfield added another $40,000 to the figure. Gary's shell company structure, once formally unraveled by Daniel's documentation and the investigator's own forensic accounting, revealed accounts that had been accumulating undeclared income steadily for years. The wage and hour division referred the financial findings to the Ohio Attorney General's office, which opened a separate investigation into the LLC structure and the tax inconsistencies across all 3 businesses. Gary's attorney eventually answered his phone. There was not very much the attorney could do with what had already been documented, recorded, submitted, and corroborated by 14 signed employee statements. The diner closed. For 6 days, the windows were dark and the parking lot sat empty, and the sign with the crooked D faced the highway with no one coming in or out. The staff went home and waited and did not know what came next. Rosa cleaned her apartment. Jerome fixed the brakes on his car, which had needed fixing for 2 months, but there had never been a right time. Pete sat in the kitchen of his apartment with his son, sleeping in the next room, and tried not to think too hard about what the following weeks would look like. On the 7th day, Ethan called everyone together. He sent a message through Rosa, who called each person individually. "Come to the diner Thursday morning at 10. No other explanation, just the time and the address they all already knew. They all came. 14 people filled the space that had held their working hours and their worry for years. They stood between the tables and the counter, and the kitchen passed through in their regular clothes instead of their uniforms, which made the room feel different. The same surfaces, the same layout, but something changed about the air in it. Rosa stood near the coffee station from habit. Jerome and Pete were together by the kitchen door. Carla stood with one of the other part-time waitresses, both quiet and watchful. Tasha was at the window booth with Malik beside her, his backpack on even though there was no school. He had packed it anyway. Ethan stood near the counter. "I've purchased the property," he said, "and the business. The bank that held Gary's debt agreed to the sale 3 days ago." Silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the kind that happens when something large lands in a room and everyone needs a moment before they can respond to it. "You bought the diner," Rosa said. "Yes." "This one," she said. "Yes." She put her hand flat on the counter beside her and looked at it. Then she looked up. "What does that mean for us?" Jerome asked. His voice was careful, not ungrateful, just practical, the voice of someone who had learned to ask the next question. It means the diner reopens, Ethan said. Proper payroll, weekly on time. Overtime calculated and paid correctly. Tips recorded and distributed in full. Health coverage for anyone working more than 30 hours a week. And every dollar that was owed to each of you will be paid before the doors open again. The room moved. Not all at once. A breath released here, a shoulder dropping there, the small physical language of people who have been tense for a very long time and had just been told they can stop. Pete covered his face with one hand briefly, then lowered it. His jaw worked. Rosa was crying. She made no sound about it. She stood at the counter with tears running steadily down her face, and her chin level and her back straight. The way a person cries when they have been composed through everything else, and this one thing has finally gotten all the way through. Rosa, Ethan said, you're owed $4,200 in back wages, plus 2 years of misappropriated tips. The full amount will be in your account by end of week. Rosa pressed her lips together and nodded. I'd like you to stay on, Ethan said, in whatever role you want. If you want to step back, that door is open. If you want to keep running your section the way you have for 22 years, that door is open too. I'll stay, Rosa said. Her voice was rough but clear. I've been here 22 years. I'm not leaving now that it's worth staying. Jerome let out a sound close to a laugh. Even Pete smiled at that. Ethan looked at Tasha. She was watching him from the window booth, one arm around Malik's shoulders. Her expression was the most unguarded he had seen it. Not the careful stillness she wore when Gary was in the room, not the focused composure of someone balancing plates and managing a full section. Just her face, open and waiting. I'd like to offer you the manager position, Ethan said. Tasha blinked. I'm a waitress. You've been running the floor of this diner under impossible conditions for 2 years, Ethan said. You know every table, every regular, every supply issue, and every person in this room. The job is not that different from what you've already been doing, except this time you'll have a salary that matches the responsibility and the authority that should have come with it all along. Tasha was quiet. She looked at Malik. Malik was studying Ethan with the concentrated expression he gave to things he was still calculating. Will she still have to work so much? He asked. The same as before? No, Ethan said. Full staff, set hours, real days off. Malik thought about it for one more second. Then he turned to his mother. You should say yes. Someone in the room laughed. Warm, unplanned, real. Tasha shook her head at her son the way she did when he was exactly right, and she was not quite ready to admit it. Then she looked back at Ethan. Yes, she said. Malik reached into his backpack. He had been working on it for 3 days, during the quiet evenings in the apartment, while Tasha made phone calls and reviewed documents, and the whole place hummed with the low energy of waiting for something large to settle. He had used a fresh napkin from the kitchen drawer and the red crayon and the short blue one that was nearly used up now after weeks of work. He had taken more time than usual with this one. He had erased once and restarted a full section completely, and he had held it up to the light from the window several times to check that it looked the way he wanted it to. He carried it across the diner floor to Ethan and held it out with both hands, the way you present something you made carefully and want the other person to see properly. Ethan took it and looked. It was the diner, the outside of the building, drawn straight on the way Malik had drawn it from the very first week. The windows, the open door, the parking lot suggested in a few quick lines at the bottom. But the sign above the door was different. Where the faded gold letters had spelled Donnelly's, Malik had drawn a new sign. In careful red crayon block letters, each one deliberate and evenly spaced. Mom's Place. Ethan looked at the drawing for a long moment without speaking. Do you like it? Malik asked. Yes, Ethan said. Very much. She needs a better name on the sign, Malik said, with the calm certainty of someone who has already decided. Something that means something. Ethan folded the drawing carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket alongside the others. 5 of them now, soft with handling, carried everywhere he had been since that first afternoon in a roadside diner where a 7-year-old had told the simple truth to a stranger at the next table. Months later, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Ethan pulled into the gravel lot and went inside. The diner was busy the way it had always been. Truckers at the counter, regulars in their spots, the grill going behind the pass-through. But the flickering light had been replaced. The cracked housing on the coffee station had been fixed. The napkin dispenser no longer jammed. A small framed drawing hung near the register. A crayon diner with a sign that read Mom's Place, matted carefully and hung at a height that suggested someone had thought about exactly where it should go. Rosa moved through her section with the same unhurried efficiency she had brought to it for over 2 decades, but without the measured wariness she used to carry alongside it. She looked, Ethan thought, like a woman who had reclaimed something. Jerome was visible through the kitchen window, moving with the practiced ease of someone whose workplace has finally become what a workplace should be. Pete's voice came from somewhere in the back, laughing with one of the other kitchen workers about something Ethan couldn't quite hear from the door. Tasha was behind the counter with a clipboard, the week's schedule, or an inventory check. She stood the way people stand when they belong where they are. Weight even, back straight. No apology built in her posture. She saw Ethan come in and raised her hand in a natural, easy greeting. Not rushed, not grateful in the anxious way she used to be grateful when someone was kind to her. Just a welcome, simple and unhurried. Ethan found his corner booth and sat down. From across the room, Malik looked up from the homework spread across his table. Math. It looked like a full worksheet with numbers running down the page. His face did what it always did when he saw Ethan. Open completely, no guard in it, no calculation, just the uncomplicated expression of a child who is genuinely glad someone has walked through the door. He raised his hand in a wave. Ethan raised his back. Rosa appeared at his elbow with the coffee carafe before he had fully settled. She poured without being asked, the same way she had done every morning since that first week when she had sized him up and decided, in her quiet and deliberate way, that he was someone worth pouring coffee for. She set the cup down and moved on without ceremony, the way people do things that have become good habit. Ethan wrapped both hands around the cup and sat in the warm, ordinary noise of the place. He thought about nothing in particular for a while. Then he took out his phone, set it face down on the table, and stayed. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and stay close. There are more stories like this one waiting for you.